Good evening and welcome to Wisdom Wednesday. I guess I'm here. Um, you guys, you're going to hear this fan in the background. The weather in DC has been out of control. It was so hot on Monday. It was so hot. And I was so furious because it was like 40 degrees like last week. And so it was like 80 degrees on Monday. The house was boiling and I was so close. I was so close to turning on the air conditioning Monday night, but thank God it started raining, but now it's freezing. And I just came into my office and flipped the switch and the fan is still on. So now I had to put my sweater on because I'm now freezing. I love and hate this time of year. My allergies hate it. It's very pretty. I love the cherry blossoms, but I cannot stand the dysfunctional weather. But anyway, I'm here. It is Wednesday evening at or around 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you guys know, my name is Naomi. I go by the How To Chick. I am a child of God, a wife, a mom, an attorney, a coach, a mentor, and a speaker. But most importantly, I believe you can do anything, but you can't do everything and you must choose wisely. And usually I come on to talk a little bit about love, a little bit about life and relationships. Most importantly, the relationships that we have with God and ourselves, because they necessarily inform all of the relationships that we have with others. And last week I told you I'm starting a series on offense. And the reason I'm doing this is because I have had several conversations that have been interesting. And I recognize that it's not something that people know about or think about, especially in 2025, where we want to talk about protecting our peace and cutting people off. And sometimes we interchangeably talk about having boundaries and also at the same time how we set and enforce those boundaries sometimes isn't quite the purpose of a boundary. Because remember, a boundary is for you, it's for you. It's not against another person. A boundary is for you. And so if you're setting a boundary to hurt somebody else because you feel like they've hurt you or offended you, that's not a boundary. That's the spirit of pettiness. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about how to isolate the spirit of offense. If you missed my live last week, go back, watch it. We're talking about why the spirit of offense is so dangerous and why it can knock us off of our assignment. You guys know I'm unapologetically a God girl. I believe that each one of us has a good work, a special work, an important work, and some of us have many good works to walk in. And many times the enemy uses the spirit of offense to knock us off of our assignment, to keep us from reaching our potential, to keep us from reaching the people, right, that we have been called to serve. So tonight we're going to talk about how to isolate, how to recognize and find out if you're operating in the spirit of offense. In many cases, a spirit of offense is not just a negative emotion. It's not just a feeling that someone has hurt you or harmed you. They're two separate things. So I'm not one of those Christians who says, forgive, forgive, forgive everybody, no matter what they did to you, just, forgive them and move on. I think that having boundaries and recognizing who is your assignment and who is not, I think that, you do have to forgive, but forgiveness does not mean allowing someone to continue the behaviors and to continue to have access to you. So I am not here to speak against boundaries, and I am not here to speak against having reasonable and good ways to deal with people in your life who have done wrong to you. What I'm here to talk about is the spirit of offense, very specifically. Again, watch last week. That's someone who holds on to something, a negative emotion in their heart from something that someone has done to them, whether it was a perceived slight. And we talked about the difference between a perceived slight and an intended slight last week, or whether it is from someone who has just done something and they don't even know what they did. But now you have this spirit, this emotion, this anger, this bitterness, this hate. Maybe it's pride. You feel like you should have warranted a bigger place in their life or their attention. But most especially, the most dangerous place where this comes from is unforgiveness. Because in many cases, right, someone has done something, but they have apologized. They have sincerely apologized, and you have decided, and I'm not talking about, again, we talked about the big bads. We talked about abuse. We talked about betrayals that, are not something that you would just go back to being in relationship with the person immediately. after an apology. We're talking about situations where someone misunderstood something you said. We're talking about situations where there were competing interests and you chose something that they were not a fan of and you apologized to them, but you had to lay out your reasons for it. They may never agree with it, but it was your prerogative. We're talking about how the spirit of offense gets inside. And I guess the easiest way for me to start is in Proverbs 6. So Proverbs 6 in chapters 16 to 19 talks about the things the Lord hates. Yea, 7 are an abomination to him. 1, a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wickedness, feet that are quick to run to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. It is really important for us to recognize anger, bitterness, hate, pride, and unforgiveness are, it's like a foundation for all of the ills in the relationships that we have. And what really happens is something legitimate happens. Someone legitimately does something. You see someone and they don't speak to you, and you think, oh goodness, I don't know what I did to them. Why are they not speaking to you? You see someone and they have gotten a promotion, right? Or they have gotten married and your relationship has crumbled and now you have some bitterness, right? You see someone and they have beat you out for a promotion. They have gotten a promotion that you were both trying to get, and now you have hate in your heart. You see someone, or you are in a relationship with someone. Let's go there. You're in a relationship with someone and they do something that makes you feel unappreciated in some way. And we talked about this a little bit last week. So, couples communication styles, couples gifting styles, people have different love languages. And we talked a little bit about Cain and Abel. God said, bring me the first fruit of your flock, and Cain brings fruit. And what happens is that we get angry, and that anger turns into pride because we feel justified and vindicated in doing what we did because we felt like it was a good thing. We wanted to do a good thing for that person, but they couldn't appreciate it. So now our anger has turned into pride. Our pride has fed our anger, and it has now formed the root of unforgiveness. That's what we talked about last week. When you become offended to an extreme, it breaks down the relationships that you have. And we did talk about this last week. But it's also very hard to have a clear conscience for the reason that we talked about last week. And so we're talking about how to isolate the spirit of offense in your life. It's a deep and it's an honest question, but most of us never think that, especially in relationships that have gone wrong. We're just like, nah, me and that person, we don't talk. We're just like, no, I don't mess with them. Nah, we're not cool. They know why, right? These are the type of conversations we have. We may have these conversations in our mind. We may avoid that person. That person may not see us for 6 to 9 months, whether or not they're reaching out. It may be years, whether or not they're reaching out. We're always unavailable. And there are times that you can do that and people don't even know why you're mad. So you're mad. You're operating in this spirit of offense. You are completely caught up in how this person has made you feel, to the point where you're not able to take stock of what is real in your life and in your relationship. And so the spirit of offense is a trick. The spirit of offense will cause you to believe, like, have you ever seen, and I think I may have kind of briefly mentioned this last week, have you ever seen a situation where people just can't stand each other? Like, there are family members, right? We all have those people in our family. These people may not have talked to each other since before you were born. Like, nah, they can't be, don't sit them at the same table. Yeah, she's going to be over there. He's going to be over there. But if you go to try to find out what happened and the people tell you the story, it's something silly. It's something crazy silly. Like, she got a new outfit and he spilled juice on it. Like, he, was going to ask a girl out and his cousin went and asked the girl out first. And, this is 40 years later. Neither one of them are ever even married to the girl. They probably don't even remember her name, but they're still not speaking about it. And sometimes we think that seems extreme. That seems a little crazy. But the truth is our emotions and our past experiences have to be processed. And I've talked about that many times. The spirit of offense is tied to what we felt, not what was real. There are times when someone can do something to you and you will not even bat an eye. You'll be like, whatever. But let your cousin do that. Let your husband do that. Let your best friend do the same thing. And now it's on site. Why? Because you thought the relationship that you had with them was such that they would never do whatever this thing was to you. And mind you, it might be something small, but you're thinking in your mind, they know how much this means to me. They know how much this matters to me. Why would you do this? So I want to talk tonight about how to recognize whether you have emotional pain from past hurt and past experiences that has led you into a spirit of offense. And I want you to evaluate this, whoever you are, wherever you are. I really want you to take stock, because I had to do this for myself, because I really wondered, if I was deluding myself about living at peace with all men, right? As the scriptures say, as far as possible, live at peace with all men. First sign, emotional. Somebody brings that person's name up, you're quick to react, you're sucking your teeth, you're rolling your eyes, you're like, you're willing to stay home from something you really wanted to do if that person is going to be there. Anything someone tells you about that person, you assume the worst about them. And the next thing is you're replaying loops in your mind, right? You keep replaying what they said or what they did, but more importantly, you take yourself to that place of how you felt regularly. Maybe not like on a daily basis, but when you engage in other interpersonal conflict, you'll find yourself replaying a loop with the person, right? That person. You'll find yourself rethinking about that situation. It becomes a loop in your mind. Why? Because that is where your root is. The next thing is your thought patterns. So let's just say you can't automatically think of one person who makes you mad and tense and angry, makes your chest tense up. Think about your thought patterns about certain people. If when you think about a certain person, the first thing you think is they always, they never, or you immediately feel bitterness or frustration, if you feel victimized by them, you feel like that person and everyone who quote unquote took their side is against you, just know that is an unresolved emotional pain. I'm sorry, guys. I'm in indigestion tonight. But what I do want to remind you is that there are ways to check in any situation if the response you're having, because what happens with the spirit of offenses, it is not limited to that person. And so when you're doing these checks about emotional reactions to people and the thought patterns that you have when you think about people, you also have to look at new situations. If you find yourself in a situation where you're immediately triggered and you start having similar thought patterns, they always, they never, or you feel like this person is against you, or you have bitterness or resentment from something a person says or does. You may not know this person well. They may have just walked in the room and you're already like, oh, I can't stand them. Think about it. Think about it. Because you need to go back and allow yourself to sit with what that person did or said and what it actually triggered inside you. Where does it take you back to? Some of us are not going to be able to just dig up this root because we've been watering it for 5, 10, 20, 40 years. These are not little roots. These are big old oak trees of unforgiveness and bitterness. But what we can do is keep them from poisoning other relationships while we bind them. And I'll talk about what that means shortly. So spiritually speaking, if you're viewing the person, this new person that you just met, or this new situation or relationship or whatever, through this spirit, and you know that you're offended. You know that you're feeling bitter, that you're feeling angry or hurt or sad or betrayed, and this person has done nothing to warrant that. You have to do some self checks. Am I seeing this person in this situation clearly? Is there truth here? Would I want this person to assume what I am assuming about them, about me? Is this feeling that I'm having going to block me from something that I need in this situation? Because in many cases, this happens in relationships with people that we need, right? You go into a class and a professor reminds you of that uncle that you have an issue with, and now you can't stand him and you're being disrespectful and having side sentences. You go into a new job and it reminds you, right, of your parent that disrespected you and did not value your autonomy or your opinion, and now you're offended and you are going to get yourself fired and mess your career up because you're not evaluating the truth of the situation. And the last and most important question is this: have I invited the Holy Spirit to sit with me in this emotion and help me understand why I'm feeling like this? Or am I trying to sort my feelings about this person or this situation on my own? And I talked about binding the spirit of unforgiveness. And I think that is really, really, really important, because what happens is when you're offended, it becomes extremely hard to have a clear conscience. We talked about this last week, because all you can think about is what this person did, how they did, how it hurt you, and so you are not able to focus on or even think about forgiveness because you're so deep in the spirit of unforgiveness, in the spirit of offense, that you cannot focus on anything edifying. You can't. So even if you are at that place still with whatever the root of bitterness is in your life. And last week, I'm going to keep giving this disclaimer because I think it's important. This is not about abuse. This is not about trauma, PTSD, anything that has happened to you that you need to unpack with a therapist. This is about what happens when that root grows. If you are unable to get to deal with the root of what happened on your own, first, you have to acknowledge that, walk through that emotion with God, but also see where it has seeped into your other relationships. For example, if you dealt with physical abuse as a child and you had a parent that was abusive and the other parent didn't protect you, there's a root for both parents. And many people work their whole lives at dealing with the parent who was the perpetrator and not the parent who failed to protect. And they wonder why they have such strong negative reactions to certain people. And that is because they see the spirit of the parent that allowed them to become a victim. So how do you isolate and root out the spirit, the root of bitterness, unforgiveness, and offense? The first thing is to bind it. The first thing is to bind it. So if you guys have ever seen a tree growing, you see that trees don't just get taller. Trees also get wider. And so there is a practice when you want to shrink a tree. I grew up in Southern California and we used to drive up to see redwoods, and redwoods can be, it feels like you have to drive a car for 5 minutes to get to the end of the tree. There are some redwoods that are so wide, whole roads go through them, and you can see, 2-lane roads going through the bottom of a tree that is still living and growing on both sides of the road. If you want to keep the spirit of unforgiveness and the spirit of bitterness and the spirit of offense from growing and taking a stranglehold on you and on every relationship you have, the first thing you have to do is bind it. So there's a practice in killing a tree. It's called girdling. And it basically lets you kind of peel back. So sorry, I don't think you guys hear this, but my dogs are going nuts. Girdling is the practice where you peel back the layers of growth in rings around the tree. You usually take a chainsaw or an axe or a hatchet and you just kind of peel and cut rings around the trunk. And you can, most people to make this method go faster, they apply herbicide, but it will keep the trunk from expanding. Another method is to actually take the tree and bind it. And so years and years and years and years ago, and this does not kill the tree. It doesn't pull the root out. It just keeps the tree from getting bigger, from expanding. They would take iron rings and put them around the tree. So while the tree might grow up, it wouldn't get any wider. And that would make it easier to be chopped down when they were ready to chop it down. And any of you guys who have seen, trees die for all kinds of reasons, usually diseases or being struck by lightning or things like that. But the tree trunk is the hardest part to remove. So you bind the trunk, right? You bind the spirit of offense by recognizing it, by speaking it, and by acknowledging the truth of your emotion in that moment. Because in most cases, you weren't wrong for how you felt in that moment. What became wrong is how you acted on it. So that's how you immediately bind the tree. That's how you cut a little notch out of it. You take a little air out of the sails, as they say. The next thing you would do is you put that ring on and you bind it so it can't get any bigger. And what I mean by that is you have to choose to forgive. I said I wasn't going to say this. And when it comes to, again, the larger hurts, it can be difficult, but you have to say, I am willing to accept an apology I'm not going to get, or I accept the apology I got, even though it did not feel like enough to undo the hurt that I felt. Period. Point blank. We're not talking about restoration of relationship just yet in every relationship. But the first thing you have to do is decide to forgive. Because remember, as we discussed last week, we pray, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us. So we have to forgive to get in right standing with God. The next step is to kill the stump. So you got to cut the tree down. Forgiveness, right, is cutting the tree down. The first thing you do is acknowledge it. That scrapes off some of the layers, and that can even bind it. If you say, I know this person did this to me, but it does not affect these other people and these other relationships, and I'm going to choose to look at each situation in which I'm triggered with a mindset that honors God and allow the Holy Spirit to help me process my emotions so that I do not allow the bitterness and the spirit of offense to leach into these new spaces. Cutting it down is forgiveness. Cutting it down is saying, okay, I'm no longer going to acknowledge the pain and hurt that I've allowed to grow out of this offense. I'm going to forgive this person. Now, to get rid of the root. To get rid of the root requires a couple of things. So people use mechanical tools. You can grind the stump out, but you'd still have to get a chainsaw and a tractor to pull the stump out of the ground. But in many cases, people just salt the stump. They drill the hole and they make downward cuts in it and they push salt in it. They put salt in it to fill the holes. And what does the word of God say? We're the salt of the earth. And so salting it means that you go back and you actually acknowledge what happened in that situation, how you felt. You may or may not be able to have a conversation with that person. There are people holding offenses from people who are dead and gone. You may have to do this by yourself, but you go back and you go through what happened. You walk through how you would forgive that person if they were there to accept your apology. And then you accept the apology that you're not going to get. And then you forgive yourself. Because sometimes when we see the big old oak tree of offense that we've allowed to grow in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, and in our spirits, we're angry, we're bitter, we're alone, right? We've isolated for so long because everyone in the family didn't take our side against that person. And again, I cannot stop giving this. I'm not talking about people who have dealt with abuse of any kind, trauma of any kind, where they were not protected by adults who should have done the protecting. That is something you have to walk through with a qualified therapist, preferably a trauma-informed therapist. I'm talking about people who were just offended, not people who were hurt and people who were harmed and people who were abused. You're now looking at the relationships that you've severed in your life because people didn't take your side, because people didn't agree with you, because somebody showed up and told you, hey, you're going to have to forgive them. You're going to have to get over it. And you didn't like that. So now you're mad at them too. We're talking about the relationships that were shattered when you got triggered because someone said something or did something that reminded you of that person and they weren't that person, but you hadn't dealt with what happened with that person. And so you were still triggered. You have to salt the stump. You have to take stock of your life and where you really are. You have to drill holes. That means go in and challenge it with truth. Did this person really tell me they did not want to be in relationship with me? Or did they tell me that I needed to reevaluate the grudge that I was holding in this case? Did this person really tell me that they didn't want to be my friend anymore? Or was it that they told me that I shouldn't have quit my job and cussed my boss out because I was having a bad day and they walked in and said something sideways to me? Did this person really deserve to be cut out of my life for telling me a truth, for holding a boundary with me, for reminding me that I do have an obligation to walk in the fruits of the Spirit, even on bad days? Drill the holes. Examine your thought processes. Examine where you are and how you got there. That's salting the stump. And recognize that these processes sometimes take years. But the spirit of offense will keep you in a place where you have destroyed relationships, where you are living in isolation, where you do not have the life that you want because you can't hold down a job or you can't stay in a relationship, and you have destroyed the relationships that you have had with bitterness and anger. You've got to salt the root. Getting to the bottom of it and pulling out every last root is hard work. But when you recognize the root of your offense, when you recognize where these behaviors came from, because again, sometimes these hurts are legitimate. They really, really, really are. But the enemy gains his stronghold there by feeding that little seed of hurt, that little seed of anger. He feeds it with pride. He feeds it with anger until it forms a little root of bitterness. And then he waters it with well-meaning and well-intending people who speak words that go against what you believe now, right? Because belief systems don't have to be based in fact. And so that is, the watering is coming because you are prideful. And that root of bitterness has sprung up and its roots are deep. It's time to find it. It's time to acknowledge it so that we can bind it. It's time to speak truth over what that circumstances is. Go ahead and cut out the sides so that it can't grow wider. It's time to decide that you need to forgive. Whether or not you're ready to cut that tree down, it's time to decide that you need to forgive. You may not be ready to do it. It may take a little bit more time, a little more prayer, but it's time to decide you need to forgive. And when you've done that, then you can salt the root. You can tell yourself the truth about every situation and circumstance that has now become a little add-on to this root of bitterness. Everything that has happened has fed it, has made it massive in your life. It's choked out all of the good. And so you've got to salt the stump. You've got to examine each one of those situations. You have to examine where you need to forgive yourself and others. And you have to examine where it's time for you, and we'll talk about this next week, to ask for forgiveness. Because the last part of rooting out the spirit of offense, is asking for forgiveness. It's allowing yourself to get vulnerable with those with whom you have felt owed you an apology. It's a hard place. It is a hard place. It is a place that requires putting aside our pride. It requires a level of humility that most of us do not naturally possess. And I'll tell you, when I've done it, it has been like bile in my throat. But when it is done, it is sweet. It is sweet to live in a place where your heart and your mind and your conscience are clear. It is sweet to live in a place where you are not operating from a space of being triggered, where you are not operating from a space of defensiveness, judgmentalness, bitterness, anger, and hurt. Operating out of those spaces is so painful. It's not just painful for you, it's painful for everyone in relationship with you. People may love you, but they have to keep you at arm's distance because they know that your reactions and your responses are so outsized and they cannot fix it. The only person who can fix it is you. So guys, we're a little bit over time tonight. This is a heavy topic and I struggled on how to divide it up. I thought about getting to salting the root next week, but I think next week is going to be heavy too. I want to ask you to spend some time trying to isolate the spirit of bitterness in your life. And we talked about the signs. One, the emotional reaction, right? You immediately feel anger. You immediately feel triggered. You immediately start assuming bad intent about a specific person or a situation or a circumstance that reminds you of a circumstance that you were in, either with a person or a group of people. You replay loops in your mind. You have thought patterns that are negative about that person. They always do this. They never do this. They are hateful people. You're actually ascribing intent to them in circumstances that are unrelated to what's going on. And you have bitterness or resentment that you can recognize lingers because you immediately you think about that person. Your mouth is screwed up. You're sucking teeth. You're rolling your eyes. You're angry, or you're in a victim mindset. And while that's usually related to someone who's gone through something traumatic, it can also refer to someone who has unhealed childhood wounds that allow you to always believe that someone has done something to you. And that is very dangerous. It is also in the spirit of offense. So think about that. Try to isolate a place where you have operated from the spirit of offense. And we'll talk about the culmination of the steps, pulling out the stump next week. Remember that you can do anything, guys. You can do anything. You can do very, very hard things, but you can't do everything. And it's so important for me that I let God do the choosing, but I always tell you, choose wisely. And so now we're focused on forgiving others as God has forgiven us. And that brings us to rooting out that spirit of offense, because all of us have operated in the spirit of offense from time to time. We may not have a mighty oak or a redwood growing in our lives, but many of us have small bushes that we're very proud of, and we tend to because we like it. We like having something against someone. And whether it's a small acorn or a mighty oak, it's time to root out that spirit of offense. I hope I'll see you next week for Wisdom Wednesday when we talk about removing the stump. Have a good evening. Have a great week. And I hope to see you next week for Wisdom Wednesday. Good night.